Hello and welcome to the Institute of Economic Affairs Worldwide webinar, today with Dr. Nick Cowen of the University of Lincoln on the implications of coronavirus on the criminal justice system. I'm Saeed Kamal, the Academic and Research Director at the IEA. Now, this is part of our regular podcasts, videos and webinars to help you understand the impact that coronavirus is having on the global economy.
My topic today is the implications of the coronavirus for the criminal justice system. So just to give you an idea about the direction I'm going to be going, I'm going to tell you a little bit about the UK prison context in general. I'm going to talk about prisoner release during the COVID-19 pandemic so far. I'm going to talk about the alternative reforms that we could start looking into. So in other words, can we get more radical? I'm going to ask the big question, which is really, is releasing prisoners safe? I'm going to argue that it is safer than many would imagine. And I'm going to use a supply and demand model of crime and punishment to try and explain why that might be the case. I'm going to look at the demand side of this sort of model. This is the idea that you can use punishment basically to reduce people's interest in committing offences. And then I'm going to show a kind of in-progress empirical test. It's not something that's been peer-reviewed yet. It's just some preliminary results. I'm going to suggest that this kind of punishment approach, while playing a role, plays a kind of smaller role than many might imagine. And then I'm going to look at a more promising side, the supply side, which is basically the reduction of criminal opportunities. And in that context, I'm going to say that actually a number of things relating to the coronavirus outbreak mean that we're going to end up with that it's somewhat safer to release prisoners under these conditions. Okay, let's go. Okay, so context. The UK has a relatively high prison population. You can see here, at least on these sort of comparators, among EU, I suppose, former EU states, because we've now technically left, we're kind of the highest incarcerator by head of population among those countries, except for former Soviet Union countries. And normally it takes a long time for countries to transition from communist institutions, which do involve a lot of incarceration, towards less incarceration. So of the sort of liberal countries, we incarcerate the most. Finland is quite an interesting example because although never part of the Soviet Union, it was kind of vaguely aligned institutionally for a long time, and so had a remarkably high prison population, especially by Nordic standards, and then actually underwent a kind of quite radical transition. So, these countries will eventually hopefully be getting down towards there. We've been, fairly major incarcerators for, at least since the post-war era. Of course, it could be a lot worse. The United States has a major issue with incarceration, which is like way, way off the scale. The United Kingdom is often comparable to other Anglo countries like Australia, Canada, somewhat less than us, but, still relatively high by a kind of, I suppose, developed world liberal standards. United States, absolutely, really out of this world. So we've got to bear in mind that, although I'm going to argue that we can do a lot better, we could, of course, be doing a lot worse if we were comparing it to the United States. And this is the key problem that we're facing at the moment. This is before anything to do with the pandemic. We just basically run our prisons at overcapacity. So more than half of our prisons are over, just basically got more people in them than they're meant to have according to their specifications. And as you can see, while some are kind of, uncrowded in the sense there is space, if you look up towards this end, you see there's a lot that are really, really very overcrowded. So really packed conditions, can't really do very much rehabilitation or kind of, I suppose, more positive practices, even at the best of times in those kind of conditions. At the same time, we've also got an increasingly vulnerable prison population. It's aging, like the rest of British society, and so more than 5,000 prisoners are in that kind of vulnerable over 60 category for COVID-19. And so we need to think about whether, what we can do to protect them. One solution, which, I don't want to kind of generalize, the Center for Crime and Justice Studies that put these statistics together, they think that these older prisoners should be released. I think they should be protected, but we need to look at it on a slightly more case-by-case basis on that front. The situation as of last week, it's hard to, it's a rolling, it's a pandemic situation, so these numbers are necessarily going to be out of date by the time I've said them. But this is what I found last week. We had 60 of the 117 prisons with a COVID-19, at least one COVID-19 infection. 232 prisoners have been infected. 13 prisoners have died, and in addition, 2 prison officers have also died, and they were in Pentonville prison. Now, the policy interventions so far have been quite limited. So the Ministry of Justice planned to release up to 4,000 prisoners early. So note, less than the kind of 5,000 immediate release ones that the Center for Crime and Justice Studies was suggesting. And the aim was to avoid prisoners sharing cells, which is obviously going to be one important way in which a kind of the infection could spread. And, quite conservative, it was going to be exclusively low-risk offenders near the end of their sentence. This was the kind of aim. And then, unfortunately, even this fairly minor approach was halted because after six low-risk prisoners were released in error, and they were later returned. They later came back, without too much incident. But human error was blamed. I think it sounds a bit more like a systemic problem that's kind of going on. They don't quite know who is eligible and who is meant to be being released, and so unfortunately, this is kind of lack of administrative capacity that, of course, we're kind of seeing in other features of the central government as well, like it's quite hard at the moment for the British government, I suppose, to implement the policies that it's that it's kind of stated that it's trying to do. It's like we don't have the capacity to kind of actually to kind of make these kind of these quick decisions and do them effectively. So that's something that we have to look at more broadly, but looking perhaps a little bit more in principle, what kind of radical ideas could we consider in addition to what we've tried and so far failed to achieve? I think one thing we should be looking at is a collective clemency, and it's not a crazy idea. It's kind of modeled on 2006 Italian mass pardon, where 25,000 prisoners were released because of endemic overcrowding. They had a similar problem, and approximately half of them eventually returned, due to violation of bail conditions or reoffending. But that meant that there was 12,000 or so that were kind of out and had basically managed to avoid further interaction with the criminal justice system. So we could do something similar. We could convert existing sentences to suspended sentences with probation requirements. We could also consider compassionate release and convert the sentences of older offenders to house arrests, at least when the older offenders have a house to return to. Under these conditions, I think that would be a relatively safe and perhaps even more economically effective way of continuing their sentences at this stage. The other thing, always got to be said, legalize cannabis. If this is something that classical liberal and kind of free market think tanks have been talking about for a long time. We should consider decriminalizing other drugs as well. And it's politically challenging as always, but I think it has to be mentioned. And one reason for that is, still drug offenses. People whose main index offense is probably going to be drug dealing. We don't put that many people in prison for possession anymore, but people involved in drug dealing. If we sort of legalize those markets, then we wouldn't have a reason to put, the third largest category of people in committing adult offenses into prison, and that would be a great way of kind of managing this. So that, unfortunately, that's going to be more of a medium or long-term solution, because of course that would require legislation and quite a lot of political commitment. So collective clemency, compassionate release. This is, I think, what we'd be considering in the short term. Now the question is, I think, can we reduce the prison population safely? And my position is yes. Now, everyone is interested in reducing infections. I think everyone kind of can agree with that, and that in principle, reducing the size of the prison population is going to contribute to that. The concern is that releasing prisoners could increase crime dramatically. Now, my answer to this is probably not the case. And the reason is prison ultimately plays a relatively small marginal role in crime control. And the other thing is that ultimately, having converted people's sentences to suspended sentences, we can still return reoffenders to prison. So, you know, we're not kind of committing to leave people out if they go and continue to commit offences. I have a suspicion that because the conditions in prison are now, you know, functionally worse because they present this severe risk of getting an infection, a potentially fatal infection, that in itself might be a strong reason for many offenders to avoid reoffending. So there's a good chance that that will kind of work in the favor of this kind of approach at the moment. That I think people even more than usual will be keen to avoid a further prison sentence. Now, the other reason I have some relative confidence about this is that prison can also be criminogenic. It increases subsequent crime in many cases. So in other words, it's not always clear whether our current policy is actually contributing to crime control rather than kind of making it worse. Overall, levels of crime victimization are more heavily influenced by the supply of opportunities to commit crimes and against that situational prevention. And I'm going to argue essentially that social distancing policies have the side effect of reducing offending opportunities. So that's kind of where the action is in terms of reducing crime. And I think as a result, we can be more confident that reducing the prison population at this stage would be safer than it would be usually. So let me try and justify that, just by kind of taking a little step back and kind of thinking a little bit more about the theory. And I've got some kind of an in-progress research project to kind of justify it a little bit. We have so according to sort of supply and demand approach to crime and punishment, crime rates are determined by offenders' willingness to commit crime. And we tend to presume that the key influence that society has on crime rates is through the criminal justice system. Through punishment, criminal justice extracts a higher price for committing offences, and that makes sure that crime doesn't pay. And by contrast, we normally take the supply side to be given or at least somewhat beyond social influence or kind of unpredictable in some way. So in other words, we can't rely on that side in order to kind of reduce offending. So punishment, from an economic point of view, has, these, I suppose, four kind of functions behind it. At least this is the idea in theory. Incapacitation, that's the simplest. You remove offenders from the community so that they can't commit crimes in the community. Whether they might still be committing crimes in prison is another matter, but often the idea is community safety. That's kind of like the kind of core concern that people tend to have. Then we've got specific deterrence. So that's discouraging individual offenders. The idea is if you punish an individual offender for an offense they've previously committed, they're hopefully going to be put off committing more offenses in the future. Then there's the kind of, I suppose, the more kind of Beckerian way of looking at it. That's the Gary Becker approach to looking at it. You've got this idea of general deterrence. And so there the idea is the purpose of punishment is not really, or at least principally, to discourage an individual offender from offending. They're almost too far gone already. Instead, you punish them in order to put off a population of potential offenders. So you announce that you're going to punish people in a particular way, you commit to it, you do it, and that is what sends a credible signal to other potential offenders that there are going to be consequences to committing crime. That's the idea behind general deterrence. And then there's kind of rehabilitation, where this is the idea that even though you're committed, you're doing this punishment, hopefully you can at the same time provide offenders with skills and psychological support in order to reintegrate into society. And obviously this fourth one kind of tracks a little bit against the other one. There might be trade-offs between them. So just to kind of give, just to put some sort of, I suppose, a bit of theoretical skin on what I've just been discussing. A lot of people will be familiar with this, your classic supply and demand for for goods. So this is stuff we're wanting when we want to try and get hold of something. You've got a supply curve here, which is people's willingness to supply at a particular price. And then you've got kind of the level of demand, which tends to be represented by people's willingness to pay. So we kind of say here, if we've got people demand at a certain level, this is the price that people are willing to pay, and this is how much gets to be supplied at that price. If people want more of something, they raise the price. Or rather, people are willing to pay more, which means suppliers can raise their price, and you kind of go up the supply curve. You've shifted the demand curve along here, and that means you end up with more goods produced at a higher price. This is kind of the supply and demand idea. Now, the theory of deterrence and the theory of punishment is the same, except it's just the opposite. It's the inverse. The price of crime is not designed to encourage more of it, but designed to discourage it, to encourage less of it. And willingness to offend slopes in the opposite direction, because the more you're willing to punish, at least in theory, the less crime you should be getting. And so what you get is the quantity of crimes produced in a society. That's going to be where this kind of crosses, where the number of crimes that people are willing to commit and the level of punishment that people are willing to pay for, or for the government is willing to supply in order to kind of discourage people from committing crime. So a similar approach, just once again going opposite direction. The idea is that if you raise the price of committing crime, so you commit to catching more people and putting them into prison, perhaps for longer, that kind of thing, then you shift along the willingness to offend, the kind of supply curve, and you end up with the proportionately smaller quantity of crimes with a kind of a higher kind of penalty associated with each one. So that's the kind of idea. But does the theory fit reality? There are unintended consequences of punishment. They prevent offenders from acquiring useful skills in legitimate labor markets. It often labels offenders formally as deviant, marking them as unsuitable for reintegration into society. It's psychologically destructive and thus has psychologically destructive effects, and that prevents prisoners from returning to normal life when released. And it reduces access to and even destroys familial relationships and other sources of social support and reintegration. So the big question is, which of these effects, the positive effects and the negative effects, how do they balance out? And so that's kind of where my little empirical test comes in. It's quite hard to kind of test these things. It's quite hard to kind of develop a conceptual vision of punishment, which you can kind of which is sort of observable, measurable in practice. But I've tried with these project team members, associated with me at the University of Lincoln and two others at the University of Birmingham. We've tried to do a test of the classical criminological deterrence theory. Now, in classical criminology, the composition of a punishment is the certainty of getting caught, the severity of the punishment, and the celerity, that is the speed by which the sanction is implemented. So basically how long you're waiting to get caught after you've committed the crime, and then when the punishment is actually meted out. That's the deterrence package. And in order to test it, we've got data for 41 police force areas in England and Wales from 1994 to 2008. We've got recorded crime rates for burglary, theft, and violence against the person. We've got our independent variables, which are the detection rate, the average custodial sentence length, and the average waiting time between crime and conviction. So the idea there is we've got kind of measures for each of our kind of deterrence part of the deterrence package. Detection is certainty, sentence length is going to be our severity, and waiting times are our celerity measure. And we've got them for burglary, theft, and violence against the person. We've got some socioeconomic variables that are kind of well-known kind of modifiers or kind of factors that help to determine what we would expect the crime rate to be in the population in general. I can talk about them later if you'd like. And we have a model which is a linear function using detection, sentence length, and waiting times, and the socioeconomic variables to predict crime rates. we lag our independent variables. So there's a time lag. We use the previous year's variables to predict the dependent variables of the next year in order to restrict the influence of reverse causation, although economists will naturally think that we probably haven't control for all of it. And we use fixed effects to control for time invariant unobserved differences in police force areas. This is more or less what I've just said, except it's written in econometricese. We can have a look at it, but my co-authors are really more the best people to talk to about how this is framed. But it's basically the previous slide with a bit of algebra. Here are the results. And once again, happy to go back and look at, go into the weeds on this, but here are the results we can read. With the nice stars where we've got some nice statistically significant results. And I think the key thing to take away from here is that detection rate is fairly consistent. Increasing detection is associated with drops in subsequent recorded crimes. Average prison sentence length, not so consistent. Significant, not quite as consistent as our detection rate, so a bit more variable. But while theft and burglary, increasing the sentence length appears to decrease crime, for some reason, increasing the sentence length of violence against a person increases crime. So a bit inconsistent there. Not much action going on in waiting times, except for violence against a person, where interestingly, lengthening the wait of time, in other words, less celerity, is associated with a decrease in violence against the person. Hard to kind of piece apart. It's something that we're working on with other tests and other models to try and explain at the moment. So the takeaway is that higher detection rates reduce crime across all crime types. Higher average prison sentences reduce acquisitive crime but increase violent crime, and the literature more broadly is similar on this. Waiting times have no observed effect on acquisitive crime, but for some reason reduces violence against the person. And the other main thing from the perspective of the current crisis is the impacts are quite small at the margin, and with the exception of detection, they're pretty inconsistent. So there's a lot that, you know, they're certainly playing a role. They're certainly playing a role in the way that we're experiencing crime, but it's not always obvious in a particular positive way. It's not always straight line reducing crime, even as it stands, you know, when we're looking at normal times. So let's look at something a little bit more promising. Let's go back a little bit to this graph. This is take two. So last time we changed our willingness to punish. We raised the price of crime. So we shifted our willingness to punish curve up, and we ended up more along that. And that was the idea. And we're finding that, you know, there might be limits to doing it. Surely at some margin that's got to help, but at various where we are now, it might not be doing very much, and in some ways it might be sort of backfiring. It might have unintended consequences. We're not in a kind of simple supply and demand world. On the other hand, if we do find a way of reducing the supply of crimes, so some kind of exogenous shift, something outside the criminal justice system, something outside the demand side, then it turns out that, well, we can reduce crime somewhat. And if we do that, then we should, from a social perspective, we should be willing to punish a little less, because we've got this kind of less, you know, we've kind of gained this sort of social welfare in terms of having fewer crimes being committed. And so one way in which we can kind of realize that gain is by reducing the amount of punishment. And, you know, it often doesn't play, you know, a prominent role in debates, but in criminology, you know, this is like a very, very solid kind of thing that happens all the time. Basically, using various approaches, essentially technical improvements, different strategies, different institutional forms, just to reduce the amount of crime that is available to be committed, thereby reducing the amount of crime in a kind of, I suppose, in a much more direct way than simply threatening to punish people. So this is a classic example. I could have put up a similar graph for mobile phones that kind of came along a little bit quicker, but car crime, so theft of cars, very, very high in the early 90s. There was a very systematic drop, part of it doubtless due to criminal justice interventions taking it more seriously, kind of keeping track of vehicle ownership and kind of introducing various things in that way. But look at these. These go together very, very closely as well. Basically, a reduction in the number of cars where there's no central lock. and a reduction in the number of cars with no kind of immobilizer built in. You know, fairly simple ideas, fairly inexpensive, especially if you're like building a new car anyway. And as you kind of bring out the new cars, you end up with a very substantial reduction in, you know, what was otherwise a kind of very pervasive kind of crime. And I can illustrate this, you know, from I suppose a very contemporary perspective. This is something that happened to me last week. This is a classic Corona crime kind of situation. So this wouldn't have happened were I not social distancing. I was bored, and a friend of mine sent me a link to a shop with some extremely underpriced Doc Martens boots, and they look really great. I was like immediately grabbed by them, and I tried to order them right there and then, Saturday night on my phone. And I was almost about to click, you know, pay, until I noticed that the shop didn't really bear any relationship whatsoever to Dr. Martens, and where I was meant to be sending the money from, no relationship to this, you know, to this kind of thing. This was, you know, I was taken in, and I'd already handed over my credit card details, even though I hadn't actually clicked pay. So, you know, bear in mind, if you put those into a form, you know, they've already got them. And indeed, these people, Monster Gotcha, they tried to buy some very expensive things just a few days later. So, you know, they've been harvesting these credit card details, and my card was in the harvest. But it was only an attempted one. Why? Because I'd noticed that the thing was a little bit suspicious, and I wasn't sure. I thought it might have just been some people trying to offload some Doc Martens shoes quickly. You know, prices are dropping all over the place at the moment. Why not Doc Martens shoes? But I was suspicious. So I locked my card. I didn't even realize I could do this quite so quickly. So it's kind of instant now. If you've got an app on your phone, this is often available for credit cards. And this is kind of a great innovation. So it's a smartphone app, makes it very, very easy to block transactions, even as a precaution. So you just say, just don't let anything through unless I unlock it. So basically, unless it's unlocked, you know, nothing's gonna get through. So it's low effort, low transactions costs. I could always switch it back on again if I needed to buy something. And it was when eventually they did try to withdraw money, and it was noted, they said it was locked, so it was blocked, and the bank fraud team were able to deal with it. So there was no involvement with the police whatsoever. Perhaps the bank will tell them at some point that this happened, but they might not, because they didn't lose any money. And increasingly, some firms like PayPal specialize in AI-driven fraud detection. So it's kind of the way they manage to do things very effectively. And so basically, this thing has probably reduced the scope for fraud of this kind by something like an order of magnitude, just by letting people protect themselves a bit more. And this is what I mean by a substantial supply side reduction in criminal opportunities. So what kind of supply side reductions in crime are you going to get from social distancing, from the current situation that we're in? Well, we have more people at home, which means you have fewer burglaries in residential areas. You have fewer people on streets and on public transport, so you get less robbery and snatch theft. You have shops are closed or have reduced foot traffic, so you get less shoplifting, fewer commercial burglaries, and you get less in-person fraud. So, you know, it's even harder to kind of actually, you know, even if you manage to steal someone's credit card, it's going to be harder when people aren't wandering around. But if you have, it's going to be harder to find a shop that's going to just kind of let you check it out quickly, as you might do in normal times. And you have fewer people out on Friday and Saturday nights, so you're naturally going to get less alcohol-related violence. Now, there's a few countervailing increases in crime. So, you know, I don't want to be completely... you know, sort of when it comes to this particular thing, I don't want to kind of say that social distancing only supplies goods in terms of crime reduction. We've got more people online. So, you know, just like with my experience this last week, there's going to be more opportunity for internet-based fraud, more kind of distracted people like me to kind of take advantage of. So, you know, that's something to bear in mind. And there's going to be more people at home, which means that there's going to be greater risk of domestic violence and familial abuse. So that's something that we have to think about in terms of public policy. It's not necessary that, you know, punishment suddenly comes back into it, but we've got to think about ways in which we can kind of reduce reduce people's exposure that way. So the solution, from my perspective of kind of decarceration, is to exclude individuals convicted of domestic violence from release back into households where potential victims are present, and to permit individuals to remain in prison if they do not wish to return to challenging household circumstances. We don't need to decarcerate completely. The great thing about social distancing is if we kind of do it at the margin, if we get it so that everyone has their own cell at least, and perhaps the cells aren't overly occupied, so there's less kind of spread in the kind of communal areas, then you're going to reduce infection substantially. You basically suddenly make it possible for people to isolate inside the prison system. So in conclusion, crowded prisons present a risk of COVID-19 infection. They may also present risks of increasing community infection. A side effect of social distancing is a reduction in opportunities to commit many types of crime. We already know from a lot of research that imprisonment has a very much a mixed impact on crime rates in any case, positive and negative. And so I think under these circumstances, we can with fair confidence reduce the prison population by suspending sentences without substantially increasing crime. Now, I understand if for various reasons you're not convinced, I'd be delighted to kind of go into Q&A about this. If you want to kind of see my working a little bit more on this, the paper that the empirics on the paper that I presented just now, that's still in progress. So we haven't actually got a paper up about that. But we do have a closely related paper, Alternatives to Custody, Evidence from Police Force Areas in the United Kingdom. We used a different model, different variables, but overall kind of came up with a similar conclusion, and also a discussion basically of how situational deterrence works. I've got that up, and that's available for free on SSRN if you don't feel like buying a Routledge book, which are often quite expensive. And you're welcome to contact me through the usual channels, and I'd encourage you to do so. So thanks very much for listening. Look forward to your questions. Thanks very much.
Well, thank you to Nick, and thank you for joining us. Don't forget to subscribe to our YouTube channel or Podbean, and sign up and check out our new IEA Daily Bulletin to make sure that you never miss an episode. More details can also be found on our website at www.iea.org.uk.